Welcome to the National Archives. I'm Judy Edelhoff at the National Archives and Records Administration, and this is our book and author lecture series that we do here in Washington, D.C. And the National Archives building is located halfway between the White House and the Capitol, so we encourage those of you who are in our television audience to come and join us. These programs are free and they're open to the public. I thought I would begin today, before we introduce our author, by beginning with an interesting article I happened to see in the New York Times on July 27th, which has not a whole lot to do with today's program, except that it reminded me of a talk that one of our archivists gave a number of years back, which was entitled From the Archives from Clay Tablets to Electronic Discs. And I thought this just reminds me, since I think the purpose of an archives is often a bit of a mystery to the public, to let you know that it's once again in the newspaper. And this time we're looking at an archives that's pretty old. And the article says, archaeologists have uncovered 3 clay tablets inscribed more than 3,200 years ago that may have been part of the royal archives of the largest city-state in the ancient region of Canaan. The tables date to the late period from 1550 BC to 1200 BC. And the article goes on to say the report said that archaeologists found the matchbox-sized tablets inscribed in the Akkadian cuneiform script while digging at the site of the palace in northern Israel. The report said archaeologists hope the tablets are part of the palace's royal archives, which may be located in an adjacent, still unexcavated room. Few writings from that period of history have been uncovered, so I just wanted to bring back what the purpose of an archive is and to let you know that here at the National Archives, the purpose is to preserve and protect the records of the federal government and also to make them available for research. And this article, I just thought, was an interesting look at a very ancient method of keeping records. Records here, of course, can also be documents. They can be maps, photographs, videotapes, films, audio tapes, paper documents. I haven't seen any clay tablets, but perhaps one of our archivists could dig one up. The author today used a number of our records, and maybe he'll say a few words when he does come up and speak. He probably used some records here at the National Archives, as well as some from the Truman Library, which is located in Independence, Missouri. And I would like to tell you a little bit about a few other programs that we have coming up, so that you'll join us for those programs if you're in Washington, D.C., or to those in our audience. Jeffrey Wirt will be speaking on August 8th. He's going to be discussing Custer, the controversial life of George Armstrong Custer. That will be our last program for August, and then we have quite a lineup for September, getting us ready for the election and for the debates. Diana Carlin begins the month with her talk on the 1992 presidential debates. Betty Boyd Caroli will discuss American First Ladies on September 12th. On Thursday the 19th, we have a talk on crosstalk, citizens' campaigns, and the media. And on the 24th of September, Jacques Lowe will discuss Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis, the making of a First Lady. He covered the Kennedys during their period in the Senate as well as the White House. And then we will conclude with a screening of the presidential debate, which takes place in St. Louis, Missouri on September 25th. And our guests that evening will be Jean Baker, Eleanor Clift, who is a weekly debater on the McLaughlin Report, Jim Wright, former Speaker of the House, and perhaps several other surprise guests. So we hope that you'll join us for those events as well. Today on the news, I was reminded again that not only is this an anniversary of an event that I'm going to mention in a moment, but today is Lucille Ball's birthday. And we have some records on Lucille Ball here at the National Archives who spent many years entertaining the troops in the USO. So I just thought I would mention again some of the types of records you might find here. But more importantly, it's the 51st anniversary of the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima. And last year, 1995, we, as well as many other locations throughout the country, did special programs on the development of the bomb, its use, the controversies surrounding its use, and the aftermath. And this year, I was looking for a way to explore this topic, but take a broader look at the issue of President Truman and the decisions that he had to make, the decisions he was faced with. And we have selected Robert Moskin to give this talk today. He's formerly editor of Look magazine and is the author of Mr. Truman's War, The Final Victories of World War II and the Birth of the Post-War World. This book tells the story of 5 dramatic months in which Harry Truman guided the world into a new era, the defeat of Germany and Japan, the birth of the United Nations, and the dropping of the first atomic bomb in the beginning of the Cold War. It's published by Random House, whom we thank for bringing Mr. Moskin here today. Mr. Moskin has reported from most of the places that are mentioned in this book, from Berlin to Beijing, from Jerusalem to Hanoi. He's been the foreign editor, as I mentioned, of Look magazine and the senior editor of Collier's. He's written several books, one of which we are also featuring today, which is his History of the United States Marine Corps. And incidentally, we have several members representing the Marine Corps today. He's also a recipient of awards from the Overseas Press Club, the Sidney Hillman Foundation, the New York Newspaper Guild, and the Marine Corps Combat Correspondents Association. He also served with the U.S. Army in the Southwest Pacific during World War II, lives in New York, and we're delighted that his wife is also joining him today here. Would you please welcome Robert Moskin?
I thank Judy for that introduction, and thank you all for delaying your lunch and coming to hear this. I hope you find it worthwhile, and I hope you'll have questions when I'm done speaking, because that's even more interesting, I think, than a direct talk always. I was reminded when Judy was talking of Satchel Paige saying, "Don't look back, they'll be gaining on you." I think historians say, if you don't look back, they'll be gaining on you. I think we all have to look back all the time. The Japanese winner of the Nobel Prize for Literature, Kenzaburo Oe, visited the city of Hiroshima on August 6th, some years ago, and he wrote, "As a child, I did not believe the old saying that one's whole life can be decided by the events of a few days. But like him, we all learned that our lives can be changed in a moment. 6 years ago, I lay unexpectedly in a hospital intensive care unit and spent my better hours thinking about my life and the age that I've been living through. And I came to the realization then that the end of World War II was a defining moment of my life and of all our lives, and I think of American history. People say the Civil War, that fratricidal combat that freed African Americans from slavery and that re-cemented the Union, made an enormous impact on our lives in the United States, and that is certainly true. But this global Civil War in our time so altered our lives that we have to acknowledge its crucial importance. Mr. Truman's War, the book, is the result. It's not a biography of Harry Truman. David McCullough and Robert Farrell have written wonderful biographies of him. What I attempted to do is to tell this story of this defining moment in our history through one of the central characters of our age. Mr. Truman's War was not the Korean War, with which his name is so often connected, and which Dean Acheson correctly called a limited war for limited objectives. Mr. Truman's real war was the 5 months in 1945 during which the Allied nations both won the largest war in mankind's history and struggled to give birth to the post-war world in which we live now. After VJ Day, Truman said that while we had won World War II, and I quote him, "We're facing another fight, and we must win the victory in that. And that's the fight for a peaceful world, a fight so we won't have to do this again, so we won't have to maim the flower of our young men and bury them." This story starts on April 12, 1945, when Harry Truman, who had been Vice President of the United States for less than 3 months, was summoned to the White House. He wrote his mother and his sister Mary in Missouri. He said, "I had hurried to the White House to see the president, and when I arrived, I found that I was the president." Truman was not trained for the job. FDR had never invited him to cabinet meetings on the war or international affairs. The highest executive post Truman ever held was county commissioner of Jackson County back in Missouri. He was never a governor, even of Arkansas. And he was never a Rhodes Scholar. West Point and Annapolis turned him down because of his weak eyes, and he could never afford to go to college. He'd been a good farmer. He said, plowing a field with a mule is the most satisfying thing a man can do, and he believed that all his life. In fact, he was the first president since Grant to be a farmer in his adult life. And when he was president, Truman said, as long as I've been in the White House, I can't help waking at 5 a.m. and hearing the old man at the foot of the stairs calling and telling me to get out and milk the cows. When he came home from World War I and married Bess Wallace, she refused to be a farmer's wife, so he became a less successful shopkeeper and an employee in various businesses around Kansas City. Overseas in the artillery during World War I, he had met one of the Pendergast boys. In 1921, the Pendergast political machine offered him a chance to become a county official, and 14 years later supported him for the U.S. Senate. Some labeled him the senator from Pendergast. Truman was loyal to the people who helped him along the way. In fact, loyalty was one of the attributes he valued most highly. When he first left Kansas City for Washington, he stopped in to say goodbye to boss Tom Pendergast, whose advice was simply, work hard, keep your mouth shut, and answer your mail. In Washington, during Truman's second term as senator, he persuaded the Senate to authorize a special committee to investigate the National Defense Program. He chaired that committee and made a nationwide reputation for honesty and integrity. But this was still pretty thin preparation for being president of the United States. Fortunately, his new presidential responsibilities never intimidated him. He was blessed with an ability to make decisions. He was not a man to procrastinate and second-guess himself. He gathered what he felt was the essential information, made his decisions, and he slept at night. And he stuck to those decisions. And he said, I don't give up what I start. I'm a stubborn cuss. All this did not guarantee the right decision, but it prevented him from muddling through a bog of doubts, and it enabled an extraordinary, ordinary man to get many things done his way. The common wisdom is that Roosevelt had everything wrapped up, the war won and the post-war world well in hand, and I found this was not so. FDR was a great president, but he had concentrated on winning a global war, and life is ever-changing, ever-moving. Roosevelt had taken the nation and the world a great distance toward victory and toward peace, and Harry Truman led the American people and the world further on their journey. The day after Roosevelt's death, Truman signed his first official document as president, a proclamation to the people of the United States formally announcing Roosevelt's death. It said in part, with clear echoes of the story of Moses, the leader of his people in a great war, he lived to see the assurance of the victory, but not to share it. He lived to see the first foundations of the free and peaceful world to which his life was dedicated, but not to enter on that world himself. Truman, who knew his Bible, was Joshua to FDR's Moses. History is our memory. We read it because we expect to learn from it. A friend of mine who's a respected historian himself and who's here today suggested to me recently that there are three categories of historians. Academic historians, for the most part, are intent on digging out new material, especially from archives, and adding pieces to the jigsaw puzzle of historical knowledge. And then there are, he said, official historians who function as to create a record, sometimes partisan, of what has happened. And lastly, there are journalistic historians, sometimes referred to as narrative historians, who seek to communicate historical facts to a larger audience. I'm in that third group, journalistic historians whose priority is to try to communicate the facts in a coherent, comprehensible way. And sometimes it annoys me when an academic historian reviews a book of mine and complains that I did not dig out any new original sources. My function is not his function. My purpose here is to look closely at a momentous moment in history and try to report it accurately and understandably. In various ways, I've spent my professional life trying to do this. While working on this book, I also encountered a fourth kind of historian. They've been given the pleasant name of revisionist. They seem determined to create a truth of which no one else has been aware. At this time, they seem to concern themselves mainly with rewriting the Holocaust, the atomic bombing of Japan, and the existence of Jesus. Even if one gives the revisionists the benefits of the doubt that they want to write truthful history, one who looks objectively at their accusations might agree that they distort history. For example, Gar Alperovitz has written a couple of thick volumes seeking to prove that the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki were unnecessary. He writes that, and I quote him, "The notion that the atomic bomb, was the only way to save large numbers of lives is clearly a myth. It's absolutely clear to most of us that the atomic bombings of Japan did save large numbers of American lives. That's not a myth. Of course, the United States could have not pressed the war against Japan to a decision. Army Air Force generals like Curtis LeMay believed the war could be decided by continuing to firebomb Japan until there was nothing more left to bomb. And U.S. Navy leaders like Admiral William Leahy wanted to blockade and starve the Japanese into submission. And you can dream up other options. But Japan's militarists would not surrender. They were prepared to hold out. They had not surrendered, for example, after the terrible night of March 9th to 10th, when American bombers using only conventional firebombs killed more than 83,000 people in Tokyo in one night. And now the United States was mounting an invasion of Japan itself by more than 750,000 American soldiers and Marines. The Japanese militarists no longer envisaged victory. They expected that when the Americans invaded their home islands, the Emperor's 2 million man army there, waiting for us, would meet the invaders on the beach and hurl them back into the sea. The defenders would inflict dreadful losses on the Americans and enable the Japanese to end the war on favorable terms. Alperovitz is persuaded that the need for the atomic bombing of Hiroshima has been a 50-year deception. I regard this decision of conspiracy and deceit as bad history, or should I say, not history at all. I suppose people in a position not to make history are condemned to rewrite it. No one on earth thinks the atomic bombs were humane weapons, but in a war in which millions of civilians were killed, and in which the United States firebombed its enemies' cities mercilessly, it's difficult to make an argument that a responsible president should not use a new weapon that could stop the killing in a single brutal stroke. But some historians who came to judgment in the 1960s and during the West's tragic war against the Vietnamese people misdirect their guilt and their disgust against the use of the horrific weapon instead of against the horror of war itself. We're here today, of course, talking about Harry Truman because August 6th is a date that still tears at many Americans. It began at 2:45 a.m. on this morning in 1945 on the island of Tinian in the Central Pacific. A large silver B-29 bomber started down a 2-mile-long runway, climbed to 5,000 feet, and then was switched onto automatic pilot. The plane passed over Iwo Jima at 5:52, and its pilot, Colonel Paul Tibbets, took it up to 9,000 feet. The 12-man crew drank coffee and ate ham sandwiches. At 7:30, Navy Captain William Parsons armed the one bomb aboard the plane. An accompanying weather plane reported in, and Tibbets told his men the target would definitely be Hiroshima. They climbed again and leveled off at 31,000 feet. The men put on heavy anti-flak suits, and 12 miles from the city, the bombardier, young Major Thomas Farabee, took charge and flew the B-29 at 328 miles an hour through his Norden bomb site. His aiming point was a T-shaped bridge near the Japanese 2nd Army headquarters. The single bomb fell away from the plane. The B-29, nearly 5 tons lighter, leapt upwards. Tibbets banked into a violent turn. At 8:16, the bomb exploded 1,900 feet above the city. 2 giant shock waves slammed into the Enola Gay, which was already 11 miles from the target. Tibbets turned and looked back, and he saw over Hiroshima the mushroom cloud. On the other side of the globe, President Harry Truman was returning home on the USS Augusta. He had just chaired the Potsdam Summit Conference, which had attempted, without a great deal of success, to shape a post-war Europe. He was having lunch with members of the cruiser's crew when the White House map room officer handed him a message from the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson. It said, "Big bomb dropped on Hiroshima, August 5 at 7:15 p.m. Washington time. First reports indicate complete success, which was even more conspicuous than early test." Truman was overwhelmed, and he told the sailors sitting around him, "This is the greatest thing in history. It's time for us to get home." And by 11 p.m., August 7th, the next day, he was back in the White House. The Washington Post ran a frontline story headlined, "What's an atom?" Here's a description from the dictionary. The Japanese did not surrender. The cabinet in Tokyo voted to continue the war. Even General Marshall was surprised. Over the next 2 days, the U.S. 20th Air Force flew 550 more conventional bombing sorties against Japan. All told in the Pacific, LeMay and his 600 bombers, using so-called conventional bombs, caused 800,000 civilian casualties and killed 330,000 Japanese. On August 8th, Foreign Minister Molotov, accelerating the Soviet Union's last-minute entry into the war against Japan, announced that his country was at war with Japan. Soviet armies, which had been shipped into Asia for months, started rolling into Manchuria, Sakhalin Island, and Korea. And on August 9th, LeMay's flyers exploded a second atomic bomb above Nagasaki. The 2 atomic bombs did not change a vote of a single Japanese cabinet member. But after the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, Emperor Hirohito stepped in. In the middle of the night, he talked with the Supreme Council for the direction of the war for 2 hours and finally told him the time has come to bear the unbearable and acknowledge defeat. The Japanese government announced that it was ready to accept the terms of the Potsdam Declaration of July 26, and I quote, "with the understanding that the said declaration does not comprise any demand which prejudices the prerogatives of His Majesty as a sovereign ruler." This was not the unconditional surrender that Truman had been demanding. Secretary Stimson said it made good, plain horse sense to accept it. Secretary Burns, Secretary of State, wanted to hold out for strict unconditional surrender. And finally, Navy Secretary Forrestal came up with a solution. He said, accept the Japanese offer and declare that it accomplished what the Potsdam Declaration demanded. And Truman liked this. After more discussion in Washington and among our allies, Truman sent a message to Tokyo through the Swiss. The United States accepts the Japanese surrender. The Emperor and the Japanese government will be subject to the Supreme Commander for the Allied powers, and that would be Douglas MacArthur. In Tokyo, the military wanted to reject the American reply. The Prime Minister, Kentaro Suzuki, vacillated. The argument dragged on for 3 more days. Truman, to keep up the pressure, ordered LeMay to continue bombing Japan with conventional weapons. Finally, Hirohito assembled his ministers on the morning of August 14th and told them further resistance would reduce the nation to ashes. He was prepared to surrender without further reassurance about the preservation of the throne. The emperor also expressed a wish to broadcast to the nation an unprecedented proposal. The Japanese had never heard his voice. He recorded an imperial edict to be broadcast the next day. Radio Tokyo informed the world. And within hours, 1,000 soldiers stormed the imperial palace to prevent the transmission of the emperor's proclamation. They assassinated the commander of the Imperial Guards Division before they were beaten back. The Minister of War and other senior officers then committed suicide. At midday on August 15, Tokyo time, which is 14 hours ahead of Washington time, the emperor's voice was heard for the first time. He said because of what he called a new and most cruel bomb, he accepted the Potsdam Declaration. Of course, it seems to me if the godlike emperor had the power to stop the war then, he had the power to stop it earlier. A professor of modern Japanese history at the Tokyo University for Economics estimates that if the Japanese had stopped the war when it was no longer winnable back in 1944, 1.5 million Japanese lives would have been saved. In Washington, at a press conference that lasted less than 2 minutes, President Truman, fresh from a swim, gave the news to the White House correspondents. And they rushed out to flash the word. The worst war in human history was over. I expected that some would challenge the centrality of Truman's role in the story of these 5 months. And a couple of reviewers have voiced the all too common view that when FDR died, all decisions had already been made, and his successor just had to mop up. As I explored the subject, I soon saw this wasn't so. The new president had the war to finish. He had to deal with allies who had conflicting national interests in Europe and Asia. In Europe, he had to chart the future of Germany and the fate of its Nazi leaders. And if he could not keep Eastern Europe free from Soviet domination, he had to negotiate with the Russians and the British where the line bisecting Europe would be drawn. And simultaneously, he had to save the war-ravaged Europeans, both friends and foe, who did not have enough food and fuel to live through the first post-war winter. In Asia, he had to determine how the war with Japan should be resolved. Should he hold to Roosevelt's unconditional surrender policy or negotiate a peace? Should the United States invade the Japanese home islands at the price of hundreds of thousands of casualties? Should Charles de Gaulle be allowed to bring French imperialism back to Indochina? And to whom should the Japanese surrender? This seemingly minor question would have enormous repercussions throughout Asia and the Pacific for a very long time. It would lead directly to our Korean and Vietnam wars. And finally, how would a defeated Japan be managed? Truman also pushed through the fruition of the United Nations, which Roosevelt and Churchill had started. Like FDR, Truman believed that peace could be sustained if nations worked together, and the UN was the world's second attempt to do this. I was shocked to learn that George Kennan, so praised as an intellectual who contributed to shaping the post-war world, thought that involving the Soviet Union in the United Nations was, to use his language, unwise and regrettable. He hoped that negotiations over forming the UN would fail. Kennan advocated a peace based on what he called the sheer power relationships of the European peoples. Walter Lippmann was another spheres of influence advocate. They were among our first Cold Warriors. At the same time, Harry Truman had a country to run and to change over from war to peace, and he worked at it. He wrote Bess in June, "It won't be long until I can sit back and study the whole picture and tell them what is to be done in each department. When things come to that stage," he wrote, "there'll be no more to this job than there was to running Jackson County." A host of unsolved problems faced him at home. The war had not destroyed Americans' homes as it had those of both our allies and our enemies, but with victory approaching, Americans grew restless with deaths and casualties, with food rationing and gasoline rationing, with the absence of husbands and sons. Both labor and industry were eager to get back to peacetime business as usual. Unions struck for higher wages. Even before VE Day, John L. Lewis pulled out his 72,000 miners. Truman did not negotiate. He simply decreed that the miners would continue working for the government. And corporate leaders wanted to stop building planes and tanks and start producing profitable refrigerators and automobiles. Truman ordered studies on how the nation should convert to a peacetime economy and how it should deflate its wartime government. The sudden closing of war plants threw many people out of work and reduced working hours. And there was a brand new problem. Women were dismissed as men were discharged from the services and plants cut back to peacetime production. How could room be found for both the returning servicemen and the women who had replaced them and wanted to continue working, as 84% of war-working women did? The lives of women and of African Americans were revolutionized by the war. Truman declared racial discrimination un-American in nature and insisted on establishing a permanent Fair Employment Practices Commission. It was a beginning. And that June, Americans had their first taste of the coming post-war clash between national security and the Bill of Rights, and their first early warning of the McCarthy era. The FBI arrested 6 persons after finding classified documents in the office of the small magazine Amerasia that supported the Chinese communists. One arrested was John Stewart Service, a Department of State expert on China. When Forrestal urged caution so as not to embarrass the president in his negotiations with Stalin, Truman angrily ordered the Department of Justice to proceed with its investigation no matter who was hurt by it. In the end, the magazine's editor and one other man were found guilty and fined. Service was restored to duty. Truman repeatedly put his weight on the side of security until Senator McCarthy descended into fear-mongering and finally attacked General Marshall. In summary, let me note that almost everyone who talks to me about this book is shocked, as I was, that 60 million people were killed in World War II. That seems like an incredible statistic, 60 million human beings. It all surprised me to realize that World War I and II were truly parts of a single war, interrupted by an armistice and a truce that lasted only 21 years. When the killing did stop in the summer of 1945, the world was a very different place. This enormous convulsion had three political effects. First, it led directly to the end of Western colonialism. The war left all the European nations on their knees and strengthened the people of Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Europe could no longer dominate the rest of the world. Secondly, within Europe, power shifted from the center to the periphery. England, France, and Germany gave way to the two new superpowers, the Soviet Union and the United States. And third, the United States, which only 26 years earlier had refused to join the League of Nations, was now irreversibly a world power. When the Soviet Union in time overextended itself and disintegrated, the United States stood alone. And the war's effects reached far beyond politics. They were all-encompassing. Basic changes in science and medicine altered life forever. Nuclear power, of course, was the greatest scientific innovation. The computer transformed communications around the globe, and jet propulsion made air travel common and space exploration feasible. In medicine, the list of wartime advances is even longer, to cite just a few: antibiotics, the electron microscope, the sonogram, cardiac surgery. They have all extended life. And they have also, I must say, created a worldwide problem, a worldwide population explosion that I think is now our greatest problem. I've tried to leave you with some thoughts about the significance of Mr. Truman's war. These 5 months are of a fundamental importance to all of us, and amazingly, a totally inexperienced president led us through them and into a brand new world. I thank you very much. Thank you. I can only, on a talk like this, touch on this complex and fascinating subject. I hope your comments and questions will focus on some of the things that concern you the most. So I'd be glad to take questions or comments. Sir.
Do you believe Truman would not have been criticized for using the atomic bomb if the bomb were dropped on Japanese military bases instead of those two cities?
Do I believe that Truman would not be criticized? Not have been criticized for dropping the bomb on a military base rather than a city? Well, is that your point?
No, for using the atomic bomb and dropping it on Japanese military bases instead of the cities.
That's what I said. Yeah, yes, I've repeated your question. Yes. I think he would have been ineffective. I mean, the point of dropping the bomb, they could have killed the same number of people with conventional weapons. They'd done it many times over. But the point of dropping the bomb was to make a shock effect that would bring the Japanese to a realization that the militaries particularly, that they could not win this thing, that they had to stop, that they couldn't be bargaining for terms. We wanted them to surrender. We didn't want another armistice, as we did in 1918, which didn't last. We didn't want a third world war. I believe that's why he dropped the bomb where he did. Sir?
Given the fact that it's storied that Winston Churchill attempted to control Franklin Roosevelt and manipulate American policy, how would you characterize the initial meetings or relationship between Churchill and Truman?
I think it was a continuation. I'm sure that Churchill did try to manipulate Roosevelt. I'm sure he tried to manipulate Truman. I'm sure the other way around, too. That's what politicians do. But I think Roosevelt and Churchill became close allies and colleagues, and I think Truman continued that. He certainly was impressed with Churchill, and yet he stood up to Churchill when Churchill did not want him to remove American troops from Europe for the Asian War, for the Pacific War, to invade Japan. He tried to delay that movement of troops until we'd worked out our problems with the Soviet Union, because Churchill was a political wartime commander, much more than Truman did. And Truman had the responsibility to fight another war and end another war in the Pacific. And he stood up to Churchill. He went ahead and did what he thought it was the right thing to do. Yes, Zig?
Bob, could you describe the role of Jack McCloy and his influence on Truman, particularly regarding the target, which...
Particularly, the question is what was John McCloy's influence on Truman, particularly?
Yes. And
I didn't hear the particularly part.
And diverting the target from Kyoto, which originally was, I understand, pinpointed by the military as a target. And also his role in the discussion with Truman in the cabinet room when Simpson was not available and Jack McCloy was called upon to make a presentation.
McCloy was called up when Simpson was not present to do what?
And make a presentation to the president. That's according to...
I don't know that detail, Zig, but there was no question that Truman prevented the Air Forces from atom bombing Kyoto. I mean, there were a lot of people on both sides of that issue, and Truman decided it, and so that Kyoto was not bombed. I don't think even by conventional weapons. I'm not sure about that, though. Somebody else said, yes, sir.
Yes. When do you think it was first learned that the Japanese military made the attempt to stifle the broadcast of the Emperor's speech, and when did American leaders and journalists first know that? It seems to me at the very time, in September and so forth, we didn't know this detail, or at least was it promulgated or was it known?
The question was, did we know that the Japanese military tried to stop the emperor from speaking during the war? As far as I know, we did not.
No. At the very moment when they were trying to storm the palace and keep the recorded broadcasting from being broadcast that following morning. You just described
Yes.
it. Yes.
Did we know that at the time?
Know that? I mean,
It was
know it right away?
no. We didn't know it during this period at all. I don't believe, and we didn't know it till later. This was
Much later, right?
I presume so. I don't have a date for it.
Got known because we're conscious of it nowadays, but in that early period, it didn't seem to be.
It wasn't part of the decision-making process. The decision-making process was then in Tokyo. It was not in Washington. What I was describing was what was happening in Tokyo. It didn't affect what we did in Washington. We'd already dropped the bombs. We were waiting for them to quit.
But in the aftermath stories, you would think that would have been very important, particularly for those who thought, you really didn't need to drop the bomb. It seems part of that story.
Well, it's been known long enough so that the people who believe we shouldn't have dropped the bomb or we didn't have to drop the bomb would have known the story. I can't see past the light, so if somebody is raising a hand in the back, I don't want to neglect you. Would somebody?
Yes.
Would you? Okay, whoever you are, I can't see you.
Two questions, please. One, did we have and were we prepared to use any additional bombs if the Nagasaki bomb had not been effective in bringing a Japanese surrender? And secondly, I wonder if you might speak a little further on a point that you made in passing about the continuity between the First and Second World Wars. That is, in a sense, a century-long war with an interval there. And how fully have you developed this particular idea?
To answer your first question first, or try to, or at least deal with it, my understanding is that those were the only bombs we had at that moment, but that others were in preparation. In the next couple of months, we would have more bombs. And when the Japanese reply came in and was to be debated, and then there was a delay over it. Groves wanted to go on producing bombs and getting ready to drop a third one. That was his job. And Truman said, no, we won't drop another one until this process is completed, but we will keep bombing them with conventional firebombs, with napalm. It was, to my mind, a fine distinction, but it was a distinction and a significant one. I didn't study in any depth the question of the continuity of wars. It seems to me so clear from the perspective now of 50 years later that we had a blip of peace between the two wars. This was still essentially a European conflict that had not been resolved. We had not invaded Germany. We just accepted an armistice, which was not satisfactory to the Germans, obviously, to the Nazis, certainly, and turned out not to be satisfactory to us because it precipitated the second part of this procedure, second part of this war. I don't know what else you'd like me to try to deal with, but if you have some more, please add it.
Well, I was wondering, in a sense, is this an idea that had occurred to you in your own writing of this and other material, or
it's so hard to know what you. It's so hard to know what originates in your mind and what originates in your reading. At some point, I became aware of this perception, of this concept, and I firmly believe it now. Sir?
I had the idea myself and was interested to have somebody else articulate it.
Oh, I don't think it's that rare a thought. Sir?
You stated a while ago, but you didn't develop.
I can't hear you at all.
Sorry. Right. Okay. You stated a while ago, but you did not develop, the idea that the fact that the United States was chosen for the country to which Japan would surrender had implications for the Vietnam War that took place later. Would you care to develop that point?
Well, I'll do it a little bit. The United States was the prime combatant against Japan. I mean, the British and others were lesser partners, but we carried the burden of that war, I believe. When the war came to an end, and also the Japanese had occupied China, had occupied Hong Kong, had occupied a lot of colonies in Asia that were held by Western countries. When the war came to an end, we tried to allow the people who had a relationship to an area to participate in the surrender, to take the surrender, the Chinese in China, the national Chinese, not the communist Chinese, in our policy. And we put in Marines in the north to prevent the communists from taking over that part of the country. But there was a big battle, an argument about who would take the surrender in Hong Kong. For example, the British insisted that they do. Chiang Kai-shek wanted to participate in that. The British didn't want him to. Those kind of things. The Chinese and the British divided the Japanese surrender in Indochina, for example, which led to a division in Indochina that led eventually to the French War and to the American War. In Korea, of course, the Soviet Union took the surrender in the north and we took it in the south, and the line was drawn at a State Department meeting that Dean Rusk was famously involved in. Those decisions all made for historical significance because they put people on the ground. They put various nations' troops in position. The taking the surrender was not just a formal ceremony. It was taking the weapons and doing something with the soldiers who had surrendered. It was a process, and it took manpower to take care of this. And people on the ground have a very important effect on what happens. The prime example of that is not the surrender of the Japanese, but the prime example of that is in Europe, where the Soviet Union troops occupied Eastern Europe and never got out of it. We wanted them to get out, particularly of Poland, and which had been at the beginning of the war been the issue. And this was the first fight that Truman had with Stalin was over Poland, with Churchill's encouragement. And Stalin didn't have to move; he had the people on the ground. Yes, ma'am.
When Truman set up up the loyalty oath program, did he do that for political reasons, or did he really believe there was a security problem here?
I'm not ducking that question, but that's outside the area I dealt with and I studied. I don't know anything more about that than you do, really. I disagree with a lot of how Truman handled this whole question. Would you repeat the question? I'm sorry. I've been trying to do that and I missed. The question was the loyalty oath. Is that right? Would you give it to me again so I can?
I wanted to know whether it was done for political reasons or whether Truman really thought there was some security motive behind it.
This is the loyalty oath question, and whether it was done for political reasons or because Truman thought it was really a matter of national security. I don't know the answer to that. I mean, it's available, but I don't know it. Sir?
If you go back to the earlier question of Kyoto and clarify for us or amplify for us, what were the pros and con considerations of Kyoto as the target?
Kyoto was the cultural, traditional, not capital because Tokyo had been in various forms, but certainly their cultural center. And there were shrines and temples and whatnot there, and a great history there. And the people that were opposed to it didn't want to destroy those, which is more than happened in some other places, of course, as you know, in the war.
You referred several times to the number of American lives that were saved by the dropping of the atomic bomb. It seemed to me a couple of years ago when my wife and I visited the Hiroshima Museum that they made a point there, both in literature and the guides, of talking about the untold numbers of Japanese lives saved. Do you believe that that is actually their attitude, or was that put on for the American tourist?
The question was, do I believe that is the Japanese attitude that Japanese lives were saved by the use of the atomic bomb? I don't know what the Japanese believe. I have no idea. I think, in my judgment as a non-Japanese, I would think that that's probably true. 200,000 people were killed in Hiroshima, and the number was less, but not much less in Nagasaki over time. And I think if the war had gone on, and if we had done what LeMay wanted to do, which was to bomb every place in Japan until there were no more places to bomb with napalm, with conventional bombing, would have killed many more. I believe that, but this is just my opinion. It doesn't make any difference. Yes, sir.
We know now that Stalin was aware of the bomb at Potsdam, but how far had the Soviets gone in developing the atomic bomb at that point?
They were nowhere near having a finished bomb, but they had a program, and they were did I tell you? I don't remember what I've told now and what I've told on other occasions, but there's the story about when, I don't think I went into it today, but there was the story about when, at the Potsdam Conference, when Truman went around the table and told Stalin that we have a great new weapon that's going to end the war, and Stalin said, great, something to the effect of go ahead and use it. And he seemed not very interested in it. But as I say in the book, the fact turned out to be that Stalin known about it all along from Klaus Fuchs and people like that, and spies in the American program. And he had a program going, and as soon as he had that little exchange with Truman, he went back and he told his people to speed it up. I think we've run out of questions, which is good. Maybe we can run into lunch. Excuse me, one more.
You said napalm was dropped on Japan. Did you mean that these were phosphorus-type bombs? The same
These were what?
That these were phosphorus-type bombs are the same used by the Germans on London when they firebombed London?
I don't know if they were the same used by the question was the firebombing of Japan used the same material as the German used against Coventry or something. I don't have any idea. I expect it's a similar material, if not the same material. Certainly the same effect. Killed a lot of people. And Tokyo was particularly vulnerable, being a lot of, non-concrete buildings, non-steel buildings.
Well, as I understand it, napalm was used on the ground by our military, but not in the bombing.
I hope I've used the term napalm accurately. I have not. I've been signaled by my military friends here. But I wish somebody would tell me what firebombing is if it isn't napalm. Incendiary?
Thermite and phosphorus.
They are phosphorus. That was the man's question. They were phosphorus bombs, not napalm. Napalm is a
Very effective against the city.
Did people hear that answer? We used the term napalm was erroneous. It was really phosphorus bombs. Thank you very much for coming. Did I miss somebody?
Thank you very much, Mr. Moskin, and we particularly enjoyed hearing about Mr. Truman's war, the final victories of World War II, and the birth of the post-war world, and we hope that you'll look for this book in your bookstores. But before we begin the book signing today, I wanted to ask if you would indulge us for just a few minutes. We have some very special guests here today. I know at least one in the front row was one of the people you thanked in the book. Perhaps you'd like to introduce a few of these people, and of course Mrs. Moskin is sitting in the second row.
I don't know if they want to be introduced, but maybe they snuck in here. We're glad not to be. But General Simmons, who was the head of military of Marine Corps history for years and years and years, and really created the program, is here. General Simmons. And General Shuttler, who is the president of the Marine Corps Historical Foundation, is here. These people, I must confess, are here because I wrote a book about the Marine Corps, not about this book, I think, although we became good friends out of the process. And Ambassador Roy Atherton is here, who is making a horrible face. He didn't want to be introduced, but Roy has been the director of the Foreign Service, and we were classmates a long time ago. Who have I left out of note? Lynn, my wife, Lynn Goldberg, who's... and a number of other good friends.
Well, we had to introduce her because the book is dedicated to her. Right. Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us today. The book signing will be at the table right here, so we ask you to line up along the wall there and join us for the next program when you can. And thank you very much again, Mr. Moskin, for coming today.
Thank you, Jim. Let's see if anybody wants it.